First item under discussion is Title I funding for charter schools and turnaround academies. Basically, we have had further conversation with the U.S. Department of Education, and we are submitting 2010 data, baseline data that the U.S. Department requested, and that's due to them by October 16. Seeing no more discussion on the topic. Assessment and accountability update. Oh, you do have questions, Sarah?
I'm just looking for kind of an overview of
Sure.
where we're at in terms of, I just heard you say that the information is due by October 16th. What is kind of the overall next step? Where are we looking?
So it's my understanding that the State Board of Education, the U.S. Department of Education will be looking at that baseline data, and then they're going to get back with us regarding calculations. They want to go back and look at the 5-year period in which they have the authority to audit, and go back and actually determine what that baseline will be in 2010 and what that was.
So when should charter, and really any of the Title I schools, when should they expect notification of what their actual monies will be?
So Danielle, so right now what we're dealing with is the planning, okay, not distribution of monies. So we have time.
So I'm going to try to answer your question, Sarah. Having been on that call, I don't believe they made any promises on the U.S. Ed's end. They gave us a deadline for submission, as Superintendent mentioned, for October 16th. They did not give any indication of how long it would take them to review. And that was just the one set of data. And then once they look at 2010, that will give us guidance on what then to send for 2011 through to current.
Okay.
So I don't know that we can answer what their promises are. But as the superintendent mentioned, this is planning money. So
And
that's November, I think, is when we typically release that.
November is the receipt.
Typically when we release the planning allocations, so there's some time there.
So do you anticipate, and I know that a lot of it's out of your control, but
I wouldn't even begin to guess, to be honest.
I'm sorry, we can't give you a little more definitive answer there.
May I just,
Yes, Leanne.
so I know that Hazel Beasley works out of the fiscal office and has been calculating Title I allocation since the late 80s. She probably wouldn't like me to say how many years she's done it. But just knowing her and working with her, while she works with the U.S. Department of Ed, I feel very good that she will work as quickly as she can to get some things resolved.
I do appreciate that, and she is our point of contact and has been a part of the calls with U.S. Ed, and they asked for a number one point of contact, and Hazel is that for us at the department. I mean, you're right. She's done this for a long time, and we have calculated the same way for 14 years. So certainly we believe we've been following every definition that they'd like us to follow, and so we're happy for their guidance as we administer these federal dollars.
Yeah, because this is the first time we've dealt with an actual drop in what's gone out to the title schools. Thank you. So next item is assessment and accountability update. Michelle? Oh, yes, Gordon, sorry. I keep neglecting that you're there.
No worries. I'm on a little bit of a delay here. I just had a couple of questions regarding this issue,
Sure.
follow up to my prior comments. It has been reported in a widely respected journal that covers Indiana education that IDOE has been uncooperative in its interactions with the federal government. I would like to ask if you have a response to that.
Oh, I certainly would. We are nothing but cooperative, and as Leanne just mentioned, Hazel is our key point on this, and knows the formula in and out. We have been totally receptive to giving information.
And
Danielle, did you want to add anything since you were on the call?
I would like to, if you don't mind. So the article in question, I believe you might be talking about Chalkbeat. Mr. Hendry mentioned that the timeline was something, and when initially we were asked on the call when we could get 5 years worth of information to U.S. Ed for review, the answer was given maybe 30 to 60 days for 5 years. They did put us on a pause, and they came back and said, well, what about if you just send the first year of data as a baseline, which was 2010, and then we agreed upon the date of October 16th. So I don't necessarily agree that that would be any way with us being uncooperative. It was just rather how long would it possibly take for Hazel to bring together data over a 5-year period, and she said potentially 30 to 60 days. When they narrowed it to the scope of 1 year, October 16th was a very reasonable date for us to do so. So I believe that was the reference in that article, and that would be our perspective on our full cooperation is we're happy to do so as quickly as we can with the 1 year of data.
Most definitely. Thank you, Gordon.
Madam Superintendent, if you wouldn't mind, I had a real, because she's so far away from the microphone that I'm listening in on, is there a possibility you could summarize her response for me just so I could hear it?
Well, actually, I'll have her repeat it because I'm having trouble hearing you also. Could you speak directly into the microphone?
Sure. Is this
There
better?
we go. There we
Okay.
go.
So I was suggesting that I hope that we're both referencing the same article, Mr. Hendry, which was the Chalkbeat article regarding the U.S. Ed call. And what I think they were suggesting might have been perceived in your words as uncooperative was a back and forth between the U.S. Ed and the Department of Education on the dates for submission of data. Initially, they asked for all 5 years to be sent, 2010 through date, and we were asked how long would it take for us to do that work. Hazel responded off the cuff. We didn't know that was going to be a question. She said maybe 30 to 60 days. They then put us on a pause, and they came back and said, what if we just asked for 2010 for us to get started with our review? How long would 2010 data only take? And she responded, and we agreed with October 16th. So you can see that the scope was definitely narrowed on the amount of data to be sent, so obviously we could do that work faster. So I believe that was the reference that was trying to potentially perceive us as uncooperative, when in fact we are trying to be more than cooperative and more as quick as we possibly can get information to them.
And we are, I can assure you, Hazel will be in direct contact with the U.S. Department of Education to get the work completed.
I'm really glad to hear that. Thanks for clearing that up.
You're welcome.
If I could ask one more question, is it my understanding that the Department of Education has engaged a Washington, D.C. law firm to assist it on these discussions with the U.S. Department of Education?
So actually, we have had a contract since 2014 with a firm by the name of, and I'm going to get this wrong, Bernstein and Manafsovitz. I can't get that right, second word right. So they've been in contract with the department as well as 30 other states, 30 other SEAs. Their specialty is providing support to SEAs around the uniform grants guidance that is issued by U.S. Ed. So they have actually come to the department, done full training with our financial staff, our executive team staff. So we've had them on contract since 2014. So when this issue came up, obviously around something they specialize in, we did seek their support to continue to have these conversations with us. So no, they were not contracted for this specific issue. It was actually, again, ongoing collaboration and a contract since 2014 for which we continue to collaborate with them on all U.S. Ed grants guidance.
Okay, but we are incurring some legal fees as it relates to this Title I issue.
I don't have knowledge of their actual details, but again, this is just ongoing collaboration. We reach out to them with a number of questions.
Many of the states utilize that service because they specialize in working with the U.S. Department of Education.
And if I get a point there, you're doing exactly what we should be doing.
Absolutely, I believe
Of
so.
course.
I mean, we need legal counsel. Every school district has legal counsel. The department does, state board does. We need legal experts to deal with the regulations in which we have to follow. So it just makes complete sense that we would do that.
And
I'd be disappointed if we didn't seek legal counsel.
And I guess I would also add that the department is a neutral administrator of the fund. So we're a neutral administrator of the Title I funds, and so we have an obligation to work with the U.S. Department of Education to make sure that we're following their guidance, whatever it might be. Thank you very much.
Well, I would just add, I hope that the department continues to work diligently on this issue to find a satisfactory resolution as soon as possible. Thank you.
You're welcome. Next item is assessment and accountability update. I think Michelle is here, and Rich, are you in? Oh, there he is, okay. And I know he has a presentation as well. Michelle?
Thank you, Superintendent Ritz. Oops. And members of the board. Appreciate the opportunity each month to provide an update and have 4 topics that I wanted to share with you today. The first one is an update on ISTEP, and One of the things that we've been reporting on each month is a transition from CTB to Pearson. So certainly we have met the milestone dates for the handoff of items and the psychometric materials that are related to that, the statistics that were needed by the Pearson team. It was a great opportunity, actually, last week during the cut score setting. We invited Pearson psychometricians to come and observe that process so that they would be familiar with Indiana's process and expectations for the grade 10 cut score setting that Pearson will provide next summer. So they did have two psychometricians with us last week, Pearson did. And so Dr. Dong and Kim actually was able to spend a good amount of time with them. That was really helpful, I think, to make sure that their questions were answered and any interpretations that they had about the statistics that needed additional guidance. So that was really great. So I added that as part of this slide. Both the iRead and the iStep contracts are with Pearson now for review, so it's the contracts are with them for signature. They've been through our tax clearance process, legal review from our team, and so they're now with Pearson staff. And certainly one of the things that we're gearing up for is the online testing in spring 2016. And so very early this morning, I did send a listserv message to CTCs, and we'll put it out in the DOE dialogue also. And it has information about Pearson's online testing platform. And I don't want to steal Rich's thunder, so I'm going to let him talk more about the platform itself. But one of the things that we plan to have in late October are more item samples from Pearson that we can actually put in a platform in November. And that's something called EPATS. And again, I don't want to steal his thunder. He'll give you more details about that. But we are gearing up for providing support to sites. And I think I mentioned this perhaps last month, that one of the things that Pearson did include in their contract was to have some minority, women, and veteran-owned business folks actually go out to the field and assist schools that needed support in being able to test online for the future. So that is part of the plan as well. Support for students and educators just kind of flows right into what I was just discussing, and that is in terms of support for what the assessment might look like and making sure that it's really an instructional tool. And you might remember that was something that we did last year, is actually talked with the field about ways to use the practice test and the Experience College and Career Ready assessment tool that we had last October as an instructional tool. That those items are not secure, and we really want to encourage teachers to use them. Parents are welcome to look at those items as well and talk with their children about those. So in November, we will have EPATS available, which is an electronic piece from Pearson. And again, they'll talk in more detail with you in just a few moments. And certainly, we're opening the practice test much earlier than in the past, so that schools will have ample opportunity for teachers to use those items in the practice test with students as an instructional activity. The next topic on the list is just a very quick one. I think there was a question maybe about what are the fall assessments, and so this is just a list, and I won't go into detail unless you have questions about that, but here's a list of the assessments that are ongoing, many of which have already started last week, and today is the PSAT. So the alternate date is the 28th of October, but certainly our ECA window opens this Friday. And last but certainly not least is formative assessment. And there are several pieces in this update. Just wanted to give you kind of the next steps regarding not only schools and corporations, but vendors that are going to provide the tools, as well as the fiscal work that needs to be done behind the scenes. So I'll spend a few minutes just on each one of these. So in terms of corporations and schools, some schools actually entered into agreements or had an intent to participate in the use of a tool with a vendor that was already existing. And certainly, just to reiterate that we encourage schools to use these tools starting at the beginning of the school year. So there shouldn't be anyone that's waiting to use any tools. Hopefully they're already taking advantage of any of those tools that they thought were most appropriate for their students. But many of the schools and corporations have already paid, and so they'd like to be reimbursed. And so that certainly is part of our process, is providing reimbursement for them. And kind of get back to that in just a moment when I come back to fiscal. And the next step regarding the vendors is communicating the school list. and the counts for students, which will actually be collecting that at the end of October, is the end of the collection window for student counts. And certainly providing, there are 4 vendors that would like to enter into a master contract with the Department of Education. So we'll be facilitating that. Other vendors either wanted to do both, master contract and a local contract, or only a local contract. And that certainly was up to each individual vendor to make that decision. And in terms of fiscal, so there are several steps here. The first step is for us to actually get the actual student counts as of the end of October, and we'll use that count and the allocation of the $12 million to determine the final per pupil amount that's available for both English and for mathematics. So that's really our first step. And then each of the assessment tools had a different price, and so we'll go through and allocate the amount that was needed for each of those and determine any local and master contracts that need to be entered into. And then, of course, equally as important is the K-2 interest among schools. And so we did, you might remember, we asked schools to indicate in the request if they wanted to use a K-2 tool, for how many students, which content area, and which vendor they would like to use, vendor or vendors. They certainly had a choice of multiple vendors. So we want to also do the K-2 work as soon as possible so that schools can have that information as well. And then certainly we, as a department, we need to provide an update to the state budget agency. So that's on our list of things to do, as well as reporting back to the state board. And a little bit of information.
Yeah,
Oh, I'm so sorry.
I bet we have the same question. Go ahead, Sarah.
I have a couple of questions. The
Back
first
up.
one, last month, we had some conversation about the type of information that was required to be reported back. Have we sent clarifying directives to school corporations on what the expectation is of information they need to provide?
So our guidance hasn't changed in that. I know especially Senator Kinley was interested in knowing the effectiveness of tools. When we've made allocations in the past for formative assessments, we've always required the data to come in, mainly at the aggregate level, to see the effectiveness of tools that are being used with taxpayer dollars. So the guidance hasn't changed as of yet. More guidance will go to the field once we have the student counts and we're able to determine what the allocation was and what tools are actually part of the master contract versus local contracts.
Department request for information and not a budget agency request for information?
Yeah, I think we clarified last month, based on your questions, that the budget agency really needs the financial information.
Is that
oh, I'm
something that
sorry.
has to go through the data committee then, or is that?
I don't think so. That's
Part of our contract,
that's-
and in fact, it would
Yeah,
probably
it's-
be irresponsible of the department not to collect data on the use of the assessments with taxpayer dollars. That's always been part of what we do with all contracts.
And then my only other question was looking at, does the final grant distribution come before the board for approval, or is that something that's done solely within the department? I thought that that was,
It'll come to you on November 4th.
okay.
Yes,
And then at that point, we'll make determinations for the remaining.
Right. right.
Okay.
If I may, I know that Brian Murphy drew up, we asked for the opinion with some of the requirements for collecting information and data. And so from the information shared from Brian, was that would not need to be a requirement for school districts. And so where are we if there's a difference in interpretation?
I'm,
I was going to say, probably someone from our team that's working on that needs to address it, I would say.
Danielle, did you have comments?
As the chair of the data committee, since that's kind of been referenced here a little bit, I think in your question, Sarah, so the data committee would be any requirement that is a school-level data submission requirement. This is not a school-level data submission requirement. This is of the vendor themselves. This is nothing the school has to provide to the department, nor that the school has to provide to the vendors. This is between the vendor and the department. We hold the contract with the vendor. We set the parameters for what is required of that vendor, and for every formative assessment we've ever had, we've always required a level of aggregate data to be submitted to the department. And again, to the superintendent's point, the responsibility on the taxpayer dollars are on these assessments, tools that are worth having our taxpayer dollars spent on. Without receiving some level of data from those vendors to the department, we would have difficulty being able to have an intelligent conversation around those tools. So we are not asking anything of the schools to be submitted to anybody.
No, the schools aren't involved in submitting any data.
But potentially, and I think where it came up last month, and correct me if I'm wrong here, is that we were looking more from the standpoint of, would a vendor be excluded if they did not
We have not
Have
had
the
anybody
ability to
question
send
us. I know you questioned, Sarah, were any schools hampered, I think maybe?
Right.
And who they chose. Nobody has contacted us with that as a concern. So if you've had any specifics of a school who felt like they were hampered, please have them contact us. We'd love to help them through the process.
Right.
But we have not had that concern from the school level, other than your one mention of it last month. And again, we'd be happy to know if that has hampered anybody. As far as I know with our vendors, none of them, again, it's standard practice for us to ask for a certain level of aggregate data from our vendors.
And you'll notice from the two charts that you have that we have a lot of assessments and quite a bit of others that we're working with here as well. And the field, I might add, is very appreciative of having that local choice.
What kind of school data or data that you just mentioned?
I said
Be
aggregate.
specific
Yeah,
about
sure.
that.
I'll let Michelle answer what we typically have gotten, like on acuity, for example, Steve, when we've used that, Dr. Yeager, like what
Yeah,
we've received in the past and what we expect to receive again.
Use fine.
So looking more at overall student performance with regard to how students perform overall on, for example, if there are 3 windows, looking at, hopefully students are growing from one window to the next, but really looking more in the aggregate as to whether or not this tool is a good one to spend taxpayer dollars on. I think one of the things we want to be mindful of is that I think folks want more and more information as they decide in year 2 what tools they want to use. So part of our, I guess, due diligence is to think about which tools actually provided good data to schools and information that they could use
Wait,
to
say that
inform
again.
instruction.
Say that again. Go back to, you just kind of said, we want which schools, and I lost you.
So some of the schools have asked us, for example, if they have to use the same tool for 2 years. And so they're very interested in knowing the impact and the effectiveness of tools that are out there that they didn't select that they might want to use in the future. So part of that is, for example, with Acuity and M-Class, gathering information to ensure that the taxpayer dollars are used wisely and that we actually can give feedback as to whether or not, for example, we had KEEP do a study on Acuity. We also had AIR do a study on M-Class, just to make sure that we were using tools that were actually informing instruction.
Well, I want to reassure you that I think all of us up here are interested in using taxpayer dollars wisely. And did I understand you to say DOE is going to receive data directly from vendors to DOE?
Like we always
Right,
do.
it comes from the vendor. It's at the aggregate level, so no students are identified in the
Yeah,
data.
we don't have any student data.
Yeah.
That's within all our contracts, Steve.
Your contracts with whom?
Like in
Vendors,
the past, like
assessment.
with Acuity, with all of our assessment contracts, we always get data regarding the product. I mean, that's why I said that would be irresponsible of us to enter into contracts with all these vendors and not have data supplied to the department.
So am I to understand that?
But it's not student level data.
Okay, but am I to understand that all these companies in the past that have been used are,
This is the first time we've done this.
I know, allowed the school districts to choose their vendor that they like to use, correct?
Yes, but it doesn't change really our contract process that we utilize at the department.
I'm not getting the point where you say, okay, go ahead. Maybe you can say it better than I can. Go ahead.
Let me make a quick distinction. It's one thing to ask for, when Acuity and M-Class were provided by the state, those specific assessments were provided by the state. Schools had to send in a grant that they were willing to do that. And it's one thing for the state to request that data and do a study to make sure that the one assessment only that they were providing to the schools was a valid assessment to show growth. And versus now, the state is requesting all these multiple vendors where results aren't necessarily even comparable. So even if it's only aggregate versus student level, looking at those results, I think raises a question as to whether or not how will they be used? Why do you need this information? Because the results will not necessarily be comparable. Acuity does something different than NWEA, which does something different than M-Class, which does something different than, and the list goes on. And so there is, again, one thing to ask for something that's being provided by the state when it's one assessment for grades 3 through 8, 9, 10 as Acuity grew. And K-1-2, which is what M-Class did, and yes, I'm familiar with the studies. I helped present on one of them with Michelle a few years back. Because we saw nice results out of Acuity and M-Class. We were, both of those studies showed us nice growth. But again, it's very different once you start throwing in all these different animals that are all different and trying to compare them. I don't know what you get out of that. Confirming how many students are testing, that's one thing. The results?
We can never guarantee the funding mechanism will remain the same. This, to your point, this is the first time we've ever been in the situation to provide a choice. It's always been a state-level choice, and it's been an option. So I guess I would like to hypothesize and maybe push back on this body in 2 years from now. If the funding mechanism reverts back to the way it's been, which is there's a state formative assessment, and we would say, which of the assessments over the last 2 years provided the best student growth? Which of the formative assessments were the most pleasing to the field? Why wouldn't we want to ask ourselves some data to compare these various formative studies for which we are spending millions of dollars on? I would just ask, why would this body seeks data all the time. Why would we not seek this data?
So what I would say with that, though, is you would always do an RFP process, and that would be on the vendors to be able to show to you as why selecting their
I'm
product
so glad
would
you said
be the
RFP,
best.
because this sharing of the data was a part of the RFP process. This, as a State Board of Education and as assessment subcommittee, we worked together on the RFP for formative assessment. Now granted, the way it turned out in the end was very different, but the RFP formative assessment always included the data sharing. So at some point, receiving of data from these vendors was a priority. And so I don't understand, and I guess we're at a loss to understand why it still is not a priority.
I guess my question is, with respect to the assessments themselves, doesn't show us anything about growth. It's the assessment. Right? What will demonstrate growth is what we do with it and the instruction. So the central question is to schools, is this helping you improve student performance?
Yep.
And if the answer is yes, then it's an effective assessment for them. What are we going to derive? Let's say you have, any of the vendors that come back and say, there's no growth in student performance with this assessment. It has maybe nothing to do with the assessment at all. I think that's the question I have is, I want to ask schools, is this helping you accomplish your goals? And if the answer is yes, then keep using it, and we'll support it.
Absolutely. I can't agree more, but again, not knowing what the outcome is going to be and not asking on the front end for at least the data to be provided in an aggregate way from a vendor to the department, again, I'm not seeing the harm in receiving it either. As a researcher, I'm not a researcher. I actually don't ever want to be a researcher, but I actually think people would say, where is the information over the last 2 year period? Now, sure, we could get it later on, but again, I don't see the harm in, again, receiving it.
Can that information be extrapolated from the school's performance? The school has selected a formative assessment A, and we look at the school's performance, and can you derive some information from that to say that things are going well?
Sure.
Or things aren't changing, and now you have an opportunity to help inform instruction or inform the school around their school improvement plan moving forward.
And I trust schools will do all those things you just described. I don't want to continue answering questions I'm not asked at this point, Superintendent.
Thanks. I know Brian we've asked you to draft a memo. Would you mind sharing your opinion?
So the memo I was asked to draft concerned the legal issues, not the policy issues. And I have a few concerns. Number one is, this is specific to the formative grant. And in the grant appropriation, there is no mention of a prerequisite requirement that schools be required to put in their local contracts, that vendors have to release this information, or that schools have to provide this information to the state. Now, there are other appropriations that reference reporting requirements. Most of them are federal. And there are other grants that lay out conditions like the charter grant we just discussed. There is not no such condition in the appropriation language for these formative grants. So it's a concern to me if it's going to place a burden, any sort of burden on schools, and if it's a condition prerequisite to them receiving the grants. Those are my two concerns. In addition, this appropriation language came out in a legislative session where the legislature created a data reporting committee to reduce data local to state. That's very significant. And to me, requiring a school to provide data to the state or requiring a school to put in their local contract that the vendor release the data to the state is problematic. And so those issues cause me some concern legally. And if the policy is a good policy, and Mr. Moore is going to disagree with me on those issues, and a lot of his memorandum in response was, this is a good policy. If it's a good policy, run it through the data reporting committee, and then bring it to this board for approval as a qualified data reporting requirement. So those are my concerns.
But the schools aren't reporting anything. Like, the schools are not reporting anything. They have no obligation with the data at all. We're not going to ask the schools to do anything.
Well, but it's my understanding, and I'm hearing different information, but it's my understanding that schools will be, how is that going to be enforced? How is the state going to enforce the local vendors that are chosen to report data? It would be through the local contract.
Superintendent, I think that's the risk that I feel when you say the schools are not going to have to do anything, but that means we have no control over what's released. So I have a concern about, as a
There's no
school
submitting of
corporation.
data, is what I'm saying. In case he's talking about the data committee, there's no submitting of data on behalf of the schools at all.
I think the concern is not whether or not the data is going directly from the schools to the state, but what the schools are going to be allowed to do with their own data. So if this
They
data is
can
being reported
do
to the Department of
whatever.
Education, does it still allow the local school district to hire experts like Carla Egan or somebody else to do any sort of local analysis that the district's going to
Can do
want?
anything they want to. We're not even, none of this is even apropos to the discussion. Like, why would the state of Indiana, we're not going to interfere in anything that goes on with the assessments, these assessments at the local level. Quite the opposite. So let me put my personal spin on this, because I had a lot of conversations about making this local. We had conversations at this board, and I thought, what a great idea to have local choice for these assessments. They're going to utilize these as they want to, improve their instruction, move forward, and get going on however they want to. The state of Indiana and the Department of Education is not going to interfere in that whatsoever. The whole point, the whole process of what we're doing was we were trying to also give choice. Some local schools already had a contract with some of these vendors instead of the state of Indiana. So we could have just as easily at the department said, look, the department's going to own all of these contracts. We're going to own them all, and not even give a choice for that when some of them had them ready to go and moving forward. So what we're talking about here is the department being flexible with the school corporations to begin their assessments as soon as they could if they already had contracts. We always collect data on our vendors, like always. So it's a matter of all of our contracts. That's what we always do. I don't know what the downside is to any of this, that the conversation actually confuses me quite a bit, because that's something we would always be expected to do, would be collect data on an assessment vendor that we're going to actually be distributing monies for. So we were trying to be flexible with those who already had contracts. For most of these, and I don't know the numbers, we own the contracts. Is that right, Mike? That's kind of where we're going to be.
So then I'm getting different information from than what was in Mr. Moore's response to.
Well, I'm not privy to actually reading the responses here right before this
But
group.
the master contract, if a school can opt into the master contract, that's not imposing a requirement. If they are contracting with a local vendor, and my concern was, and there's a requirement being put out that you have to put this in your contract, and that provision would have to read that vendor has to release that data to the state, that's the concern.
So what you're arguing with is that we shouldn't have allowed flexibility to move this forward as fast as we could, because some schools had contracts and they wanted to be able to assess their children.
My argument is a legal one. And this, to me, also, as a collateral effect, would provide more flexibility, in my opinion, to local districts. In terms of their contract, in terms of their negotiations with their contracts with with whatever vendor.
Well, I can tell you the department was wanting to have as much flexibility to move this forward as we possibly could. And we talked about all kinds of ways to actually do all these contracts. We had numerous conversations amongst all the entities and the parties, and we moved forward on all this. So the collection of data in our contracts is just simply that, because why wouldn't you? I don't know why you wouldn't. It's not going to interfere with any data collections at the local level. They're not going to submit anything to the Department of Education, but we are expending money for these assessments.
But
I get your point, and we'll probably have to talk offline, obviously.
my concern is it going to create an obligation on schools? Is it going to create
We
an
have
obligation?
not gotten a negative feedback on this. I just want to let you know, at the Department of Education, we've not had anybody reach out to us that says, hey, we don't want to do this or we don't want to do that. We personally, at the department, have not had any concerns regarding this topic.
And that's fine. I don't have survey information about what, I'm speaking from a legal perspective. And if this is considered to be a good policy, there's a data reporting committee that can make recommendations, that meets frequently, that can make recommendations.
But we're not asking any schools to submit data. It's the vendor that we are releasing money to.
So if I may, I'd like to read the exact language in the assurance document so that we're all clear what schools have been asked to sign. The language goes as follows. The corporation assures that data as requested will be submitted to the Indiana Department of Education, the department, exclusively by the corporation, or will direct the formative assessment vendor to release the data directly and exclusively to the department, and will sign any release necessary to have the data released by the formative assessment vendor to the department.
So that's the crux of the issue?
It's part of the issue. It's a multifaceted issue. So we have a legal concern here. There's a concern about the exclusivity and data sharing and what that creates for the locals, where if I am a local superintendent and I want to have a third-party set of experts come analyze our data, this language is handicapping their ability to do that.
No, that is...
Well, I read it as follows.
And that actually preceded
No.
this body directing us to enter into the master contracts to hurry this along. So that language was drafted in advance when we were going to be having everybody enter into their own contracts, and then we were directed to go ahead and do the master contracts where possible. So actually, Mike just said...
That's not current.
It's not current, it's not accurate, we've not had any concern from locals, and...
Because I know that's not where we ended up with anything, so...
Preceding the master contract component of this.
So we're dealing with something that was created prior to. I just think we need to be getting some people together in a room, because obviously there's some miscommunication that's going on, because it has never been the intent of this Department of Education under my oversight to do anything but give locals flexibility to the max. Not only choosing their own assessments, but actually choosing how they were going to do their contracting, and that the department would be working with that. But to not collect data from our vendors when we're actually giving out the money to support that is, in my personal opinion, still irresponsible of us to not do that. But that language that you just read, that is not what it is that I feel we're doing at all. So we have to get together and decide what it is that was going on. I don't think this is the forum to continue this dialogue. It's not going to be solved right now. But it's obviously quite a bit of miscommunication on what is really happening here and what's happening with the Department of Education. My question that I was going to bring up is regarding where are we on track to actually funding the K-2 portion?
And if I can just interrupt before. So the language that was read, that was part of the application process that all school districts had to sign and submit. And so, so I do know that I recognize that from the actual application to districts.
Well,
And
I'm not sure that's exact wording. We need to check on what was going on or what has happened.
And then I'm curious, as we talk about, that now there's a master contract, but how many local districts are still entering into their own contracts on their own?
Yeah,
Yeah, I don't have that with me, actually, to answer that question.
we
but
didn't
I
come
can
with that information. We certainly can get it to you, though.
Because that could, if all the districts are entering into the master contract, but if many are entering into their own, then it could be problematic for a school.
I think it's the reversal of that, but we'll get information for you.
Superintendent, if I may interject, and then Sarah, I know, once you go first, you've been
I
trying
was
to.
just going to say, if we're confused, I can guarantee the field is confused. So yes, this might need to be a conversation that
Most
does
definitely.
happen outside of this forum, but I think we need to be very clear and specific with the documentation that is sent out into the field as well.
If I could add, thank you to the DOE for providing these funds for this formative assessment. We
Well,
really.
you're welcome, and the only intent is to be totally flexible with how we do this.
Okay, the difference is, if a school has anything other than acuity and whatever the other system was, they weren't used to having to share and send out. So that's the difference.
I
And
know.
I think that's the
It's a
anxiety
change. It's a change.
that we have of that. And the concern is, how's that going to be used? And where's it going to come up 2 years from now or 6 months from now? That's the concern. So please don't feel like the general population out there, public school population, is not appreciative of the dollars out there. And when you first talked about this, I was very supportive of that. I just want you to know it's the change, and it's the anxiety that the local districts.
And we'll work through the change, so.
Anxiety the local districts have
That's okay.
regarding that. So we're just not sure where that's going to show up.
I appreciate your comments, and we'll work through the issue. So, Michelle, where are we on K-2 funding?
Sure. So one of the things that I may have mentioned earlier is we did have a few schools, a handful of schools not click submit, so we did go back and work with them. We also had schools select, if they didn't want to use a vendor that was on the list, they could click other and provide a different vendor name. And so those vendors actually had until last Friday to provide evidence that they meet the requirements of providing data right away to schools, informing instruction, all of the things that we've asked all of the vendors to do in participating in the grant. So we've had 18 actual other companies or tools, if you will, on the list for consideration. So our team right now is actually vetting those 18, Superintendent Ritz, to answer your question, to see whether or not those would be acceptable based on the criteria that was established, again, giving important data right away to schools to use. If any of those 18 are deemed not acceptable, then the school actually has the opportunity to select a different vendor. And because not every vendor is the same cost, it's challenging for us to answer that question today, but certainly we want to answer that as soon as we can, and as soon as we finalize what vendor every school is going to use in 310, then we can actually determine what dollars are available for K-2, and that's actually something we will do right away. We're not going to wait on that. So as soon as we vet those this week, give the school an opportunity to select a different vendor if needed, and then move forward in calculating based on the enrollment counts. So in early November, we would know whether or not we have K-2 dollars. And it's my hope that we would actually present that on November 4th so the board could see that information.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
So this is going to come back to us on November 4.
Yes.
Thanks. Are you completed with your
Almost.
portion?
Almost. So one of the questions that I know you're probably anxious to see that was included in the PowerPoint is, who are the vendors that schools are interested in using? Just to give the board some information and background about that. I did put a few notes here on this slide that you hopefully saw in your packet. One is that a corporation is a general term that's used to also identify non-public schools, charter schools, and choice schools. So wanted to be clear on that. Also, these are certainly draft estimates as when we pulled this information to put in your packet. So these are as of October 8th. And last but not least, sometimes a school actually selected multiple vendors. So the number of corporations looks like many more than what we actually have in our state, because a school might have selected one vendor for grade 3 reading, but a different vendor for grade 4 math, and so on. So I just kind of wanted to let you know there's like a duplication, if you will, of the corporations on the list. So I put draft estimates all over these last two slides, but did want to give you some idea of the kinds of tools that are out there that vendors were interested in offering to schools, and that schools saw fit to actually meet the needs of their students. So as you can tell, we have lots and lots of participation, which is very exciting, and we're really glad to see that. So here's the English language arts estimates, and followed by the math estimates. Again, we'll provide updated information to you as final numbers when we can bring those to you to share. The last piece of information I had, reaching out to CTB to talk to them again about comparability, just to give a quick update, if I may.
Oh, you may.
Certainly, their research staff went back, did determine that the online and paper forms are equated, but certainly we want to share that information in more detail with Drs. Briggs and Raper to see if they have additional questions. And the final document will be provided for them on Friday to review, so I'll work with Cynthia to set up a conference call with those folks, as well as Carla Egan and Dr. Barton, who was also at our cut score setting. Make sure we answer any questions that they have, Superintendent Ritz, and then bring that back on October 28th.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
I think, Rich, we're ready for you. And thank you, Rich, for the meeting just the other day.
Oh, yes.
Yesterday, I guess it was.
Well, good afternoon, Superintendent Ritz and members of the board. My name is Rich Young, Vice President, Vice President for State Assessment Services with Pearson. Thank you for inviting us back again to give you an update this month. I did bring backup today, so we can maybe get a little bit more detail on some of the things that we're doing. I'd like to introduce Peg Heck, who's our program manager over the iStep and iRead3 programs for us, and Jared Miller, who is our senior project manager here in the Indianapolis area, working with a lot of our subcontractors here in Indiana, and really kind of helping to facilitate a lot of the activities here on the ground. So just wanted to introduce them, give them a chance to talk here in a little bit too. We also have dozens of other team members hard at work at home, as you're probably well aware, on various activities, including content development, psychometric analysis, preparing the tests for the 2016 assessment, technology, preparing all the platforms and so forth. And so I did want to acknowledge them as well. And then also, Dr. Walker referred earlier to our partners here in Indiana, our subcontractors, the minority, women, and veteran-owned businesses. So I wanted to also acknowledge them as well. So we have Brilliant, who is a local firm, helping us with training and technical support, NTAP and Sandy Solutions, who will be working with Brilliant as well to provide that field-level support and technical support. Sandy Solutions also helped us with recruiting for item writers this summer, and that was a great help. RJM Logistics is a shipping subcontractor for us here. They will get engaged here in the spring, as well as Quality Printing. They will probably be engaged here in December and possibly into January. Bingle Research is a subcontractor we've lined up to help with surveys. So after the assessment, we want to know how we did. What were the assessments delivered effectively, efficiently, and what could we do better? So Bingle Research will be helping us with that. DocuLaw is another contractor to provide some of our manuals in support of an online tool that we provide for all of our manuals to make those more accessible. Fat Adam is a local firm to help us with website development, and we'll probably get into some of that here in the next few months. Virtuoso Education, Renee Aziz, I think, is still here. Here, Renee. Renee's been faithfully coming to the board meetings as well for quite some time, and we're very happy to have them on board to support professional development. Finally, BC Forward. They're another subcontractor who has been involved in the previous contract, helping to recruit scorers for the assessment. So we're very happy to be able to provide some additional continuity in that regard, with probably having many of the same resources on board. And then finally, GH is a Braille subcontractor out of Lafayette. I think they were a spinoff from the University of Purdue, or Purdue University, I'm sorry, whichever it is. And we're very happy to have them on board. They are a Braille subcontractor, as I mentioned. They're not minority women or veteran-owned, but they are located here in Indiana. I'm going to ask Peg to give you a little bit of an update on the contract status and so forth.
So some of this information is going to seem very familiar because it's the same as what Dr. Walker has presented just a few moments ago. We did receive contracts yesterday. We're really excited about that and hoping that we move quickly on getting those signed. The transition is going well. We meet weekly with CTB and IDOE to talk about the transfer of items and data and reach a common understanding of the terms that Pearson uses and that CTB uses, so we know that we're talking about the same things when we're asking for information. And we feel that's going well. We did receive the statistical data files according to the date we agreed on, and we're working with those currently. We've completed numerous committee meetings over the summer, fast and furious pace in July and August, but they're all done, and we're moving forward with test construction. IDOE is beginning to review test maps and items as related to the test maps, and so we're on schedule for that. And the training and readiness information has started, and the first communication went out to corporations today. So.
A quick question. Rich, and I've always been concerned about timeline and transfer of information and data, and the information that you have received in transition now from CTB to Pearson. Are you on timeline to provide for us what we need?
Yes, I'd say we're still tracking to the
thank you.
plan. Yeah.
This slide is in your packet, I believe, and it shows that the test construction, the item development starts off together and then splits off for the online and paper methods, and they run a parallel timeline with similar activities going on for each phase, the IDOE review, the quality, and then the final preparation.
Glenda, I have a question on this slide. I don't know if you were here earlier with the discussion about online or paper test, and we were talking about comparability between the two modes of test taking. And could you comment whether or not validity is different than comparability? That's a $10,000 question, right?
I'm not sure any of us is particularly qualified to answer that question, but I'll do my best.
Okay.
I think that validity and comparability are related, but they're not the same. Validity really relates to, does the content that you're assessing match what is being taught? Whereas comparability is related to the mode of administration for the assessment itself.
It's a good answer. That's my understanding as a university professor, that it's not the same. And we were talking comparability and try to make the case that the test might be comparable, but I still see a problem with the validity of it, which is a different set of criteria that you would look at. So how do you ensure that there's validity between your online mode and your paper mode, pencil and paper mode?
Well, as Peg mentioned, they do go through an identical development process. The specific steps for publishing those tests are a little different because of paper and security differences and so forth. But we work very hard, and we actually do a lot of research in this area to make sure that what a student experiences on paper is comparable and is in parallel to what they experience online when they take that assessment, to try and really minimize those differences as much as possible.
So you just used the term again, comparability, and I guess I'm trying to move you toward validity, which is different than comparability. I understand that they will be comparable, but will there be validity for each of those tests separately from each other? Because that's the key question, right?
Yeah, and I think that's where you're kind of going over my pay grade a little bit. I may have to bring in additional backup next month to help answer some of those questions if you'd like.
I think that's the key ingredient, because we hear a lot about whether the test is valid or not.
Yeah.
And the discussion about comparability, it's important, but it's really a different set of questions and a different set of answers. And some of us have been asking this question for over 2 years: is there validity to this particular test? And the answer has been yes.
Mm-hmm.
And now we're slowly saying that, well, maybe it isn't.
Yeah.
And so there's a real concern about the validity of each one. And I would ask that maybe you can get back to us, maybe in writing or next month. But again, it's not the comparability test that I'm looking for. It's the validity test
Sure.
of each one, which is much different.
Sure.
Do you understand?
Yep. Yep,
Okay.
absolutely.
Thank you.
Madam Superintendent, members of the board, I'd like to provide a brief overview of our computer-based testing components. I'd also like to highlight a few bullet points from our readiness window, which begins next week, and our practice window, which begins next month. So I'll begin with our computer-based testing components. So first, Pearson Access Next. Pearson Access Next is a system that administrators will use to manage student data, to set up and schedule computer-based tests, and to manage test sessions. TestNav 8 is our secure testing engine that students will use to interact with test systems. So Pearson Access is what the administrators, the test coordinators, the people conducting the test will be using, entering the data, that sort of thing. And TestNav 8 is what the students will see when they go to take the test. Next, I'd like to talk about System Check and how that works. System Check is a tool that is used to determine system readiness. No installation is necessary, and users simply visit a website with the testing workstation. There they perform a quick test to verify that the workstation meets minimum requirements, operating system requirements, Java requirements, etc. And users can then perform a connectivity test that allows them to see if the student workstation can receive sample test content successfully. System Check also helps to determine how many students can test online at one time. So System Check is a critical piece of our readiness window, which I'll talk about here in a moment, which helps schools to begin the process of assessing whether or not they can test online. Finally, Proctor Caching is a software that works with TestNav to reduce the overall bandwidth requirement for computer-based testing. So by pre-downloading the entire test content that students need and storing it locally in an encrypted format, schools are allowed to serve the test content at local speeds versus internet download speeds. So this increases their ability to test online. So Proctor Caching, in essence, what it will do potentially is allow more students to have access to online testing. And our computer-based testing components will provide for a successful administration when used in concert. We're confident that some schools that cannot otherwise test online will be able to do so utilizing Proctor Caching and System Check, our other systems. Next, I'll turn to our readiness windows and our practice window. And so as Dr. Walker mentioned and as Peg mentioned, today a letter went out to our corporation test coordinators giving them information about the readiness windows, and the practice windows that are approaching. And so in the readiness window, it's pretty much what it sounds like. We'll have them conduct a series of activities that will help them to begin to assess whether or not they can test online. And so key to that will be that they install proctor caching, that they run system check. They'll complete a device inventory, which is simply our name for a technology survey, which gives us a snapshot of the technological landscape in Indiana. It also helps them to begin to think through their capacity for online testing. So in that readiness window, which begins October 21st and ends November 13th, that's where we begin to have that conversation with corporations and the IDOE and Pearson about whether schools can be in a good position to test online. The readiness window wraps up on November 13th, and the practice window begins a few days later after we've conducted a review in the readiness window. And so the practice window is going to run for about 3 months. And again, it sounds like in the just what it is in the name. It's all about practice. It's an opportunity for schools, for test administrators, for teachers and students, and even parents to get a look at the test, to familiarize themselves with samples of the test, to familiarize themselves with the testing environment, to utilize the practice testing components. And so during the practice window, we'll conduct a series of regional trainings, and we'll also follow up with site visits for corporations that are anticipating problems or experiencing difficulty in setting up their systems to test online. That's all I have.
Happy to take any questions you might have.
Thank you.
I'm not sure if I have a different version of the presentation than what was up here, but I have a slide under Pearson Perspective that speaks about the learning locator. And so one of the benefits of being on this board for some time is that I've been able to learn from some experience. And so I'm asking a very pointed question intentionally, but it states here that June 2016 is the launch of the iStep Plus grade 3 through 8 reports.
Correct.
So I'm asking very directly, at what point will this board be notified if that is not a timeline we are able to keep?
I would say if that were to occur, as soon as we know with certainty that it was going to occur, there would be notification.
But if all goes as planned, we are looking at definitive results in June of 2016.
Yep, that's the plan.
Thank you, Rich.
Thank you.
Thank you. Next item on the agenda is the strategic planning update. Gordon, are you still on the line?
Actually, while he's listening in and engaging in the meeting, he's ill. So he asked me to give a quick update on the Strategic Planning Committee's work. The Strategic Planning Committee met quite a few, 3 or 4 weeks ago, if I remember correctly. And there were 3 primary things that the Strategic Planning Committee looked at. The first was the board's stakeholder design committee, which is made up of teachers, administrators, superintendents, folks who are currently practicing in the field, along with a couple of education organizations, make up the stakeholder design committee. Over the course of about 7 or 8 months, the stakeholder design, I think it was about 8 actually, the stakeholder design committee looked at educator evaluation across our state and looked at areas of improvement, things that the board may want to consider defining, or things that the board may want to consider in terms of additional guidance to the field, and then also looked at how to best communicate with educators. You know, we've had been hearing from educators through the course of this stakeholder design committee's work that they get communication from all different directions. It is the 21st century, so some of that includes social media, but then additional blasts that they get during the day can be really overwhelming. So the Stakeholder Design Committee also thought about how do we streamline communication efforts to our teachers and administrators and all that. The Stakeholder Design Committee presented their recommendations to the Strategic Planning Committee, of which those recommendations were approved to move forward from the Strategic Planning Committee and will be brought before the State Board in the November 4th meeting for your guys' review and approval. The primary recommendation that came from the Stakeholder Design Committee's work is defining a vision, belief statements, and theory of action for educator evaluation. This Stakeholder Design Committee spent at least 6 months working through this, and if I may say, Dr. Freitas, and weigh in if I'm mischaracterizing, the Strategic Planning Committee of the board was very impressed with the work of these stakeholders. They invested a lot of time. And I believe their summary of recommendations was something like an 8 or 9 page memo to represent the hard work that they did. So you all will be receiving that with board materials for the November 4th meeting. Remember that these are recommendations from the Stakeholder Design Committee. The board's Strategic Planning Committee gave them specific objectives to work on over the course of time. And this is a summary of all of their work and recommendations. So it's a lot of narrative on committees, but expect to see that for the November 4th meeting. Additionally, the Strategic Planning Committee heard from Leroy Robinson from the Department of Education, who is responsible for developing a family and community survey that is a valid and reliable survey. And Leroy shared an update on where he is in the process of developing that survey, what administration will look like. There were still quite a few questions that the Strategic Planning Committee had, and left Leroy with a number of questions to respond to, of which he did. But the Strategic Planning Committee hasn't met again since Leroy was able to provide that response. So we should have more information about that coming soon. And we'll come to you guys as well once we have a clear picture of what that's going to look like. Additionally, now is the time that we, as staff for the board, update the board's strategic plan and balanced scorecard, primarily the balanced scorecard. So we will be bringing that forward to you guys all soon as we receive all of the data that was requested to update the balanced scorecard. And should you have any questions about that, it's usually a really great conversation when we get to dig into the actual data and see what's going on statewide. And then, as always, taking a look at the strategic plan and figuring out, are we covering all of, meaning the board, covering all of the areas of study that we think are important? Are there areas that we want to consider or projects that we want to consider or prioritize? And there's been some conversation with the Strategic Planning Committee on things we may want to look at, making live projects, meaning that we devote staff capacity or bring in experts to help us with things. So it was a very full meeting agenda of the Strategic Planning Committee, and there are a lot of updates that are coming to you guys for the full board soon. And I would say the highlight of that are the Stakeholder Design Committee's recommendations, which has been over the course of time. The Strategic Planning Committee of the board has been updated and has been able to ask questions and really have been able to get really good feedback from the stakeholders through that process. Happy to take any questions if you have any.
Thank you, Ashley. Steve, did you have a question?
Nope.
Oh, okay. All right, seeing no more items to come before the board, I'll entertain a motion to adjourn.
Could I,
Before we do
I
that.
know
Sorry,
this
Vince.
is bad timing. Could I make a couple comments, please?
may.
Just a reflection on some of the things that have come today that I think are pretty important, and I'm standing between adjournment, so I appreciate that. You know, we have continually heard, we're getting great feedback from school leaders, teachers, and others, and families around some very important issues. And the exciting thing about that is that they understand the issues, and they understand how it's going to affect children and the schools, and I encourage people to continue to give us that feedback. But a couple of things that have come up consistently. One are things like our charter schools and distribution of Title I funds, or the lack of funding for capital projects and transportation. I would just encourage our General Assembly to get serious about charter schools and the equity that we provide for our children. If we're going to provide charter schools, then we need to fund them appropriately and to make sure that those children have the same access to the quality educational experience of all other children. I think it's just real important that we focus attention there, where we don't have to deal with these kind of issues. You know, to look at charter schools that have to open in a grocery store, or find facilities in which this state has already invested in facilities. We have vacant facilities sitting around this state that could be used for charter schools that are unavailable to them, and we have to do something about it. So that's one. The second, and I heard, you know, Superintendent Rich, you made this statement earlier, and I appreciate it. You talked about the department's focus on maximum flexibility for schools. and how important that is, and I completely agree with that. I think giving schools that flexibility, but as an example, I hope that that flexibility also extends to things like the discussion we had around advanced ed today. And do schools have maximum flexibility in terms of the way they report, the way they share information? I think that's going to be very important. So based on that philosophy as the department, I would presume that that same philosophy will be extended throughout other policy issues. And I'm also looking forward to our discussion coming up about graduation requirements and so forth. Last thing, I would really encourage our board, if you were not, most of us were not, I was part of the dual credit advisory board in which Superintendent Ritz and Commissioner Lubbers co-chaired. And I just believe that this is a critical issue for Indiana's children and families. You know, the opportunity to earn dual credit. You know, our children earned almost 400,000 dual credits last year. And when you look at the kind of savings that provides for students and families, it's just a significant issue, and I would encourage it any way that we can to lend our support to the superintendent and to Commissioner Lubbers and advancing dual credit opportunities for Indiana's children. So thank you. I apologize for the delay in the adjournment.
That's
So-
okay. And Steve, if I could request, so we're trying to collect any concerns or any comments that have come forth regarding the diploma options. So if you have things, please send them on to us because we want to make sure that we're proactive before October 28th.
And that's exactly what I wanted to talk about, diplomas, before we close up. Do we have a meeting on the 28th?
We do.
Okay. So is that publicized yet? Is that out there?
28th at 9 a.m. I guess it is.
Senate conference room 230.
You'll be getting information.
Okay. There are a lot of people listening and anxious to hear when and where that meeting is. I know we're going to have some presentations, and to your point, I know that some of the presentations are going to not only just come up and express their concerns, but also provide some solutions and some thoughts about if it's fixable. Here's some thoughts that may be helpful when you consider fixing the diploma
And it
issue.
would also be helpful to have those ahead of time if you've already got them. So
I
that-
don't have
Because sometimes within the structure itself, we've already addressed it, and perhaps people don't know we have.
Sure.
So,
Thank you.
welcome. All right, seeing no other business to come before us, I think, I'll entertain a motion to adjourn. A second?
Second.
All those in favor of adjourning signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed? We are adjourned. Thank you for coming.